The format of this session is pretty interesting. It's called Birds of a Feather. So it's not really a presentation, it's more sharing. And so we have a small group, so I hope that we can all participate. I have some questions and some topics, which I'll start with, but then we can jump into whatever is useful for the group. So the topic today is cultivating quality in open source. And this is in my job title. I'm the head of quality for Automattic, a company known for WordPress, WooCommerce, Jetpack, Tumblr, a bunch of other cool brands. We're here at the conference, so if you want to learn more about any of our products, stop by the showcase and talk to my colleagues there. So to ground us in this conversation, it's a bit about how do we help scale either existing products or new open source projects that we're working in. What's our challenge? Is it contributors? Is it the model of the product or the project? What are we trying to shift? And one of the topics for me that's been coming up a lot is the industry shift from where QA was a separate job. Raise your hand if you've ever been a QA, a tester. At least one, okay, two. Thank you for being honest. It's been a legit job for quite a while, but in recent times it's shifted to where engineers and teams are doing more and more full stack, where quality is just part of everyone's job. So I want to talk about that today, because I think that has ramifications for all open source, not just for proprietary projects. So let's just by way of intro about Automattic, we have quite a bit of history with WordPress. 22 years, as Kareem and Yost mentioned this morning. Big scale, right? But Automattic also has other open source projects. So just in our top 5 by contributors and by volume, I want to mention Jetpack. That's where we packaged up a bunch of SaaS WordPress.com, things like stats, videos, newsletters that were on WordPress.com. We made them available to self-hosted WordPressers. We also have WooCommerce, a really well-known commerce platform. I think it's the top non-proprietary open source e-commerce platform today. Things like Gutenberg, which is a more recent project where we were basically reinventing the old page model. So it was a content editor, block editor. It's not just for WordPress either. I believe there's a module available for Drupal, Civic Press, some government tech. It's being used more than just in WordPress. So what do these have in common? Billions of people rely on them as their daily tool, right? Whether you're updating your WordPress site, updating your WooCommerce store, et cetera. So high stakes for this to be user experience, high stakes for the technical quality. So that's where testing and quality comes in. So what are some of the challenges when, this is just from an Automattic point of view, but I hope during the discussion we can hear from other folks too, depending on your project or your point of view. We have paid employees, but we also have volunteers that we work with in the community, and they can come and go. And they have various skill levels. Maybe they're brand new and they're trying to write some tests because that's what the documentation says to do. Help write some tests or help write some docs. In other cases, they're highly skilled, but maybe they have other things to do and they're just a drive-by. They come in, make a pull request, but then they don't ever come back. So we have a lot of variety in contributors. We also, because of the legacy of the project, WordPress has been around so long, people get fatigued. So people want to step out of a leadership role. So someone else has to step in. And then things like the philosophy and the values of WordPress and other Automattic projects are around backward compatibility. So when you release something new, it has to work all the way back to the beginning. So for a testing environment, you have to have a lot of variations, a lot of different hosts, a lot of different PHP versions. It gets pretty complex pretty quickly. And then, as mentioned in the keynote this morning, there's so many themes and plugins that you can use, including your own that you've written that aren't even officially listed anywhere. So the ecosystem is so broad that it makes testing really challenging. So that's just the landscape of one person, but it's what I was hoping we can talk about today. And putting this all together, if quality becomes everyone's job, what are the cultural mindsets? What are the tools? What are some of the ways that we collaborate that might need to change and either keep up with the industry or maybe drive some of these changes where we're driving that change? So I put some topics up here. I'm just going to leave this up while we talk today. I basically picked 4 buckets. So we have kind of culture and mindset. I mentioned that being a QA being a separate step or a separate team or a separate person. How do we shift that into everyone's workflow? Efficiency. So imagine you have thousands of sites or thousands of different dependencies, a bit like package management in open source. How are you going to test that, right? So how are you going to do that, especially with a limited team or limited resources? So scale is important. With quality, just one topic for efficiency would be something like, you have a backlog of 5,000 open issues. You want to go through those and find the actionable high impact ones. How would you do that? And it's not going to be one person. It's got to be more efficient. Then the other two topics are, of course, AI. We could probably talk about this the entire time, right? What are we bringing to bear? What are some of the tools that you've seen work well? What isn't working well? Especially around triage or testing. And then the last topic is around community. So with WordPress and with Automattic, we have different flavors of this, but it might be like a bug scrub or a testing table at a WordCamp where people come together in person at a conference like this and we actually sit shoulder to shoulder. But what are some of the ways that we bring this to life to make sure that's not a one-off thing? So with that in mind, I love anyone who's here who's involved in this type of work or wants to start us off, just grab the mic, tell us what project you're working on. What are some of your, what's your biggest challenge right now? And then maybe we can go from there. Does anyone want to kick us off?
So in my experience, one of the hardest things to do in terms of QA, so you were talking about prioritizing, right? What is important, what's not, is always that you lack data on what is the most common occurring thing. And in the case of WordPress, what is the most common occurring combination of plugins?
Yes.
So which plugins do you test with? And so I know from running Yoast that we tested against about 100 plugins every night.
Interoperability.
Yeah, and interoperability.
If they install yours with theirs.
Yeah, but we couldn't do that for more than that because it was just unfeasible. But that list of 100 was pretty, well, not entirely randomly chosen because it was the biggest plugins out there. But I think that bit was always very hard. Like, how do we prioritize that?
Right.
Honestly, if we had a bug with Jetpack, it was always very clear very quickly.
Because it's a commonly used plugin.
Yeah, because you co-occur so often. But you'd get issues, and after a couple of years, I could say, okay, we've got so many reports. This must be a plugin with about 100,000 users to 300,000 users. I could just say based on how many bug reports we were getting in a certain period of time. But that level of, it was just hard.
I love the taxonomy you're coming up with, which is maybe a number of usage. I don't know if anyone was in the session earlier about the LXF insights with Testathons. It was really interesting. They looked at a bunch of GitHub repos and they looked at a shared taxonomy of usage, development patterns, how active is it? And it could be very similar. You could start looking at traffic on your servers, your logs, and saying what's been coming in, what are they using? So one data point from WooCommerce I mentioned. First of all, stores are high. I mean, any website's high stakes if it's your personal brand, but a store is money, right? Or it's your livelihood. So they can't go down. Like, we have to keep them up. But the average Woo store has about 45, to your point, 45 plugins. That's an average. So some have 100, some have a couple hundred. And it's funny because as a tester, you might log in and be like, why are they having all these? But in some cases, it's very small functionality, like a shipping thing just for Luxembourg or, somewhere in Belgium, right? That would be specific for that part of Europe, but someone else doesn't need, but there's a plugin for it. So yeah, that's a great point. So what can I ask you, what did you find effective in terms of solving that challenge?
What we ended up doing, because the data wasn't open on WordPress.org, is we built our own telemetry to actually see which plugins we were running alongside of. But it's one of the things I've often had discussions with Matt about. Like, I want this data to be open because this makes testing so much easier.
A bit like a site profile, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the name of the open tool? Built with type of thing?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So we did, because we had a lot of scientists in our team, we did a bit of like grouping of that data. So we got a lot of data in. It was 10 million sites. Yep. So you'd get a lot of data in, and then you did like automated grouping of which groups do we have and which groups of things should we test against.
What's likely to break?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also update cadence of these things. is something that you can actually then start to follow and keep track of. Like, okay, we released this here. We can see that these plugins had a release in the week before that, likely to be a co-occurrence here. That's actually hard. And we had for us, QA was part of a separate team. So we had
Okay.
a 6-person full-time QA team.
Is that still true today with the Newfold acquisition?
Yes.
Okay, so they're still there.
Yeah. There might be 5 or 4 now, but there's still an active
dedicated
QA team dedicated to testing it, because it's just too big. I think it's actually one of the bigger problems in the WordPress ecosystem. As your plugin becomes too big, it's very much like Android. You keep on testing against everything.
Right. And it's harder for one person to keep it in their head too.
Yeah.
All those edge cases. Does anyone else have something they'd like to share?
Maybe this is related to culture. I work on the embedded controller for Chromebooks, which is kind of a doubly weird open source project. One being that, like, Google is the maintainer of the project, and then I would say the vast majority, if not all, of the external contributors are, like, in fact, employees of companies that we partner with that are paid to do whatever they do, and like related to shipping some Chromebook, and then also it's an embedded system, and so we don't get nice things. And like there's kind of this widespread belief that, like, oh, you can't, like, do, like, software only testing on, like, this custom board that you designed to, like, do something, and so testing infrastructure is really lacking. And we spent a lot of, like, the past 2 years going from, like, negligible test coverage to, like, mediocre test coverage by by, like, developing a lot of these frameworks. And it's like it got it to the point where, like, incrementally it's pretty good. And when we were able to influence the culture of, like, our team, at least, to, like, have more and more interesting and higher quality tests for stuff by, like, developing this framework so that a person could, like, change something in a device driver and then write a test for that without, like, giving a pound of flesh. This
So the burden of setting up the technical framework helps
yeah,
the future. Yeah.
yeah, but there's kind of an extended part of that, which is like, people that companies that make components that go into these things also write code in the drivers, and they're even less used to like, caring about code quality or robustness across different builds or test coverage.
Yep.
And so initially it was like, can you write a test for this? No, I don't have time. And part of the burden of this is, like, different players here have different sensitivity to deadlines. So they're not everyone is, like, operating with the same urgency, and so it's pretty easy for someone to say, like, I need this yesterday. And so we would say, can you add tests? And they'll be like, I'll do it later. And as we increased kind of the automation of this in our like, our Garrett setup and our code review, we added a bit that was like, this needs to pass some coverage threshold or it doesn't go in. And there's an escape hatch, but having that made it incrementally easier to, like, get people to, write tests, because if you ask them on a code review to write tests, they'll negotiate with you. But if the thing turns red, then it's just like computer says no, and then and then you can just be like, hey, here's how you can like get this to pass CI, and then
It's a bit like test-driven development. If you start with everything breaking, then when you finish your code, it's green, right?
Yeah.
You have the tests. In that case, was there ever like a template? Because one of the things I think we're looking at to help scale, at least for some of these open source projects, is if someone doesn't know how to do the test, they would have a template they could look at something else and say, just fill in the blanks a little bit versus starting from scratch.
How often are they just only happy path testing?
So there is definitely a gradient of like tests that are easier, right? Because they're very similar to an existing test, and I can say like,
Copy this.
like go look at this, copy paste it, change the like this part, and you're good. And then if this is relatively infrequent, but there are like parts of the code base that just don't have like a strong existing test base, and it's harder to then say to somebody that made like a 5-line change, like, you got to go into the wilderness for 40 days to like build up a framework for this.
Yeah.
But that
On the language too, but in PHP, which a lot of us use, you have to test so many different variations of input because basically everything can throw everything back.
It's a bit like fuzz testing, right? You need a bunch of junk data, mock data, database calls. Yeah.
Okay, so we can talk all about the fun technical stuff and complain about PHP, which is easy to do. How do you get people to want to do this? I mean, so that we're talking about scaling this. People, especially in let's call it an all volunteer army. And I'm going to talk about WordPress specifically in this regard. Most people don't want to do bug testing. It's boring. It's monotonous. It doesn't bring new features to light, and isn't the exciting part of necessarily participating in an open source project. What can be done to either, I see AI up there. I don't want us to dive into a super AI conversation about mitigating the boring stuff.
No,
which hopefully it
we should
can,
bring it up.
which hopefully it can, but you're still going to have gatekeepers at some point saying red light, green light. But if no one wants to actually do the work because they're not motivated to
I think
do
you
that.
probably have some of the answers, but let me mention something that's come up today earlier. I mentioned that Insights project. They had a lot of data that needed to be cleaned up, like a SQL database to another one, to be useful in a dashboard. So what they did is they did manual, human, about 30%. Then the LLM assisted was to 90%. So someone got it set up, and then they pattern matched and got it into a pipeline. So that's one answer, is for those really cumbersome things, do enough that the machine can take over. But there's I think the more difficult challenge is the human aspect. How do we make this interesting, right? So one of the things around, I mentioned that there is some, the shift from where it's a separate team to a unified team. So one way would just be make it a bit like you were saying. It's no longer optional, right? It's part of the development process. You would write a test, you would know how, maybe actually have steps for someone else to test. For example, in a peer review type environment, let's say you have a pull request or a patch that you want someone to approve or give you feedback. You would have a 1, 2, 3 of how to replicate, or you would say, here's the steps to test it, right? So it's just like that. Sometimes it's not even more complicated than just saying, in plain English, how do you get to the state I'm in, right? So it's not even like a specific skill or degree or anything technical. It's just observation skills, attention to detail, and be able to follow those directions. So I think you could bake it into, if you're in a team that needs to get something done urgently, that's part of what you need to do, right? To make sure it's.
This is why I've never been a fan of giving everyone a task.
Right.
I much more like having a separate QA team that tests and says no, just like the computer says no.
It's like attention.
Yeah, because they're responsible for the quality, and they would get shit from me if we brought out bugs. So
I think it's a healthy tension, right? One person's saying, "There's my best work." The other party's saying, it's not so good. It didn't work in right to left, or didn't work with.
But the problem is if you let developers do that to each other, is that they all want to get going with what they find is the fun stuff again. And if you do it differently and you let the QA people do the hard bit that they like very often, we had a QA team that loved that. And they would just give them shit all day long. And they would just push stuff back until it was better.
So it's a bit of that healthy tension. And Kareem?
And full disclosure, I have a different problem because it's not consumer products. It's enterprise grade code, sort of like VIP for you guys. So our QA tasks are very difficult for a QA team because every project is a snowflake.
Different.
Right. So what we did is we made red teams, and we've gamified it where it, like a bug hunt, we actually have prizes for pointing out what your other team members.
So if you break
did
it better,
well.
you get more prizes. That's great.
Yeah. And
How's it working?
It's sort of like the sports teams. They literally are sort of, and whoever has the most bugs has to pay for the next round of beers
cool.
at our next get together and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Do you call them bug hunts or bug scrubs?
They have different names for it. We haven't formalized it. It's just sort of become
cool.
over the last decade. But yeah, it's hard because we tried to do formal QA teams, but we were constantly spending just as much time as training the team for the new project as doing the QA work.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just going to bounce around the four of us. Back in the Joomla world, and it still goes on today, is PBFs, Pizza Bug Fun. So that was a thing to kind of make it entertaining, get the people who would actually be interested in doing the QA to actually show up, and you could actually have that team just magically appear.
I mean, the benefit is that the benefit is that team works on the same product every time, and what we do, we were quite good at one point about actually writing out what we were going to build, and then have the QA write the test specs before they were actually building. So it's a bit waterfally,
Right.
but it drives, it just makes it go faster after that. I like that more honestly than most of the agile approach.
It probably depends on the product, like legacy.
Yeah, no, if you're
stage.
a bit of like USCO was at that point like 12, 13 years old, it was quite stable in many ways.
Right.
And yeah, you get that weird situation where you almost have to.
I just want to make a comment. I rep a variety of open source projects. My first pull requests in a number of open source projects were contributing tests. And I think that, when you're talking about like culture and quality and also sustainability of a project, like we can't underestimate the value of like using, contribute a test. That's like a very tangible, small footprint unit of work that is great for a first-time contributor. It's great for a junior developer, and it gets them like into the code base in a way that like is very hard to replicate. They have to learn it. They're solving a real problem. Hopefully, they like it like hooks an itch for them to stay with the project. And so, we've been talking generally mostly about WordPress, but there's other communities that have a quality problem, and so I just think that there's like a lot of opportunity for us to think about testing as not just something that should be automated away, and because AI can solve this for us, it's doing a lot more for our communities, and I would hate to see us like
a bit like an onboarding.
Yeah.
I think I love that idea. So basically saying, and I don't know if this applies to your Abe, if it's esoteric, too esoteric. But for a bigger project, you probably have a pretty good influx of new folks. Like just from the last WordPress 6.8, there were like 900 some contributors, and 200 were new, net new. A quarter were new. So imagine that's a good point. But I don't know if it's a little bit more edge case type project. How are you going to get people who are new to join if they're not coming in as volunteers in your case? No. Yeah. So, go ahead.
So coming from a non-developer kind of perspective here, but having done support and documentation, it also feels like there's an alignment issue because a lot of the times the QA test gets set up to test the spec and not the actual outcome
Yes.
of using the software. And when you start pointing out, like this is more internal team stuff, but like when it gets to documentation and you're actually trying to be like, okay, this is how it should work, and you realize that there's a problem with the spec, how do you start communicating that back to the developers to say, hey, the problem you're trying to solve is actually
Something else.
You're thinking about this in the wrong way. How do you talk about that? And then now expanding it into a community approach, how do you make it easier for regular users to report bugs and report good bugs?
Yep. That's been coming up a lot today too, where you don't want too much friction to report something, but you also don't want zero friction because you get a lot of noise. So a few required fields like upload a screenshot, tell me your URL, like where's your WordPress site, right? But you also don't want to make it like a 10-page paper that they're not going to finish, right? They just go somewhere else.
That's something where AI can help.
Yes, absolutely.
I think if we actually got an AI good chat bot that would help us create good bug reports.
So I
That
don't
would be
know if you're
magical.
familiar with Rich Tabor from the community.
I know Rich, yes.
So he's been sharing a lot about his AI workflow.
Yeah.
He has a custom GPT that's only for new issues. So it's got the structure that he wants, the output he wants. And he just talks to it, and then it ends up as a structure.
But I think if we end up building that, that's something that helps every open source ecosystem out there. If you have a good input output for
Right.
like, hey, this is what people say, this is the type of bug report we want, these are the questions we want answered.
The
You
data
guide
that we
people
need.
through it.
Right. Maybe a second part of it could ask for the stuff that you missed. Yeah.
The developer's going to be like, hey,
Right.
here's the 10 things you
Here's what I don't have. Yeah. I want to address the point about the spec versus the exploratory, because that's something that comes up a lot in QA or just testing in general. So you have the very deterministic flow, like start here, end here, right? Add something to your cart, check out, enter your credit card, done. Success message. And we can automate that with like a headless browser where it runs through and clicks on it, like Playwright or Selenium, any of these. But there's the idea of like what's valuable about a human is they wouldn't necessarily follow that. They get distracted or something pops up or they find a different way to do it, a different workaround. So I think that's a good topic because it's not just taking something that's manual today and automating it. It's how do we not lose the magic of that kind of random, what a real person would experience. So that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. Hi, Courtney. We've been talking about a lot of stuff. We've covered culture a little bit. We've covered new developer experience. I love that point. Has anyone been using AI? Anything they want to share besides the Rich Tabor example? We could talk about some stuff.
So we're experimenting in a couple of our projects with using AI to summarize. So for a lot of our open source communities will publish their meeting notes or transcriptions of their meetings if they have those online. And we're experimenting with the tooling to figure out like, because this is another obstacle for onboarding. If I'm new to a community and I learn, oh, well, they're doing X, why aren't they doing Y? I might not want to, I will not go back and read a year's worth of meeting notes to learn what was the justification, the rationale. And so the idea is like, can we use AI tooling to kind of summarize conversations, decisions, status, like that kind of stuff, and make that a little bit more discoverable for either the chairs who are running those calls, just because it's a lot to keep track of, or for a newcomer. That's experiments still.
And if the information is logged, right, like it's like a public, like the make P2s, right?
Right. This
It's
would all
somewhere.
be, these are all already, because like we don't want to feed it stuff that's not public, obviously. So this was all stuff that's already been out.
And so what's the structure, if you don't mind walking through just the tactics of it? So you have the data source, you have sort of this middle part, the LLM driven chat interface.
Yeah, and then thing that we're kind of building is a little app that's like explores the. There's a couple of our standards communities that have like specialized apps for tracking RFCs and stuff like that. And so this is kind of similar. This would be like, you know, a kind of an extension of the RFC tracker app, like, you know,
Yeah, another
because we're
source.
right, exactly. We were just feeding it more data from like
What's
those.
interesting here, just to build on that, is let's say you have that intelligence. It's the project intelligence, team intelligence, who's coming and going, all these different types. Now you can start to apply it in other places, like say in a pull request in GitHub.
Right.
You're putting a pull request. Like, hey, did you know this 3 other things like this?
Yeah. So it takes like open issues and PRs, and then like we have to feed it the transcripts at this point in time because we're just experimenting with it. But that we ultimately would be able to automate that too.
What I love about it is you're building a valuable tool that's not just for one thing.
Oh yeah, no. That's
So new contributors, you know, fatigued maintainers.
Yep.
But also our memories are bad, right? Like, what did we just do last week? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
I need to, can you tell me a summary? You know? But also it could be something that's really, let's say you get invited to give a keynote and you like, well, what were the last 6 months? Like this morning, Jim, right? Like,
Right. And that's
tell
a
me
whole
the
other
bullet
thing.
points.
It's like, you know, because like a lot of our communities like to say, oh, it's the end of the year. Let's do an annual report. What all did we get done this year? Oh, I don't know. Like,
Help me.
let me see what closed within this time.
So it's like a second brain.
yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yep. That's a great example.
Kind of piggybacking on like that, like the ability to, you know, generate a meaningful report. We've seen that, like, you know, there almost anything could be a quality issue, but there are specific types of quality issues that we can decide to care about. Like, you know, you plugged in a USB device and it didn't work, or, you know, like the thing crashed. And for at least like classes of issues, if we can get like metrics where there's a dashboard and then say like, you know, here's a threshold, or like this would constitute like a good number, and if it's higher then it's a bad number, then that can like provide some structure to rally people around, where you can say like, we're going to get crashes lower by X.
You're incentivizing one of the incentives that Kareem mentioned was sort of the peer pressure. This is incentivizing reducing errors, types
Yeah.
of errors.
Yeah. Whereas, you know, like if you say like, oh, I fixed like, you know, 20 bugs this year that were found by QA, like,
But what were the bugs?
What is that? Yeah. Like how does somebody's manager, you know, evaluate that? But if you say like, you know, I reduced like these fatal errors by X,
Yep.
then like that's something that you can hang your hat on.
It's more
a lot
impactful. Yeah.
But to do that, you have to set up the infrastructure for that reporting.
Is anyone familiar with the Core 4? It's a new framework. It's from the Dora and Space and kind of this DevX developer experience. I really like it. So we've been adopting it at Automattic. So the 4 elements of it are, it's for engineering, but it could be for any. It's like effectiveness, speed, quality, and impact. And I'm focused on the quality one. But the speed one could be any change you make to any of these culture or tools would make you move faster. The effectiveness would be kind of the scale or the efficiency. The impact would be like business or customer feedback, you know, something that's tangible. So what I like about that, just to build on what you're saying, we're not just doing busy work, right? We're doing it for a purpose, a person or a business goal or a project goal. To be able to look back on that summary later and say, which of those did we do? Having that framework up front helps you have the metrics later, I think. And that's one that's been effective, but there's other ones too. Dora is another popular one. And in the quality world, it's usually around defects, like number of bugs, change failure rate. So how many times you deploy, and of those, like say a plugin update, how many times you have to do a hot fix because you missed something. And so the failure rate would be, you pushed it, you didn't it didn't catch the thing that was caught by your community, and you had to do subsequently another quick one, which by the way is happening in Woo a little bit more than I would like. And so what we've been doing there is where we're trying to say, incentivize that change failure rate. Let's make it go down. But keeping in mind the customer, right? Keeping in mind the store, keeping in mind a human being, not just us feeling good about it. So that's a good point. We have time for a few more. What have we not covered that you would be surprised that we didn't get to? We talked about the new developer experience. We talked a little bit about AI tools, separate QA teams. Anything else on people's mind?
Well, there's one thing that way back in the day, I worked for The Guardian for a year and a half. And one of the things that The Guardian did that I loved back then already, we're talking 12, 13 years ago. Every pull request that when it was done was speed tested.
Performance.
And if it made the site slower, it was automatically closed. And it was like literally, you can reopen it, but you'll have to actually fix it. This is something I'd love to see in more projects because it actually drove performance so hard.
Because it's so front and center.
Yeah.
That's kind of what Abe was saying about if it doesn't have a test, it doesn't get pushed. We have this website, is Calypso fast yet? For the WordPress.com Calypso project. And it's just, if you're, same thing, before and after, it's not as much it blocks you, but it's like kind of like painful like to look at it. You don't want it to go into the red, right? But I think making things really public. I think the Chrome user experience project has been awesome at this. Real-time user monitoring. How does my website rank? Also peer pressure of like, where do I rank versus the percentiles of other websites? Like other newspapers. Washington Post might be faster, right? And so now you have this thing where it's like, how are we doing with our peers?
Back then, nobody was faster, but it was.
One of the projects that I saw this in the early days was Noel Talk's Happy Tables. With WordPress, a solution for restaurants. Yeah, he would, it was anonymized, but it would tell you where you ranked on all these metrics versus other restaurants using that platform without calling them out. But it said, you're behind, or you're ahead. I love that. So a lot of what we've talked about today is incentivizing, right? What are the reward structures? You mentioned that a couple times. What's the burden of like to get someone to do the thing? And also what's in it for them, I think is the other kind of topic. So good discussion.
I think it's also the lessons. The lesson is maybe also that it's easier to make a computer say no than make a human say no.
Right, you can ignore the dashboard, right? But it's hard if someone's on the screen talking to you. So a couple of things we didn't cover that would be just as to plant a seed in your mind. So accessibility testing. Playwright, which is the Microsoft's automation framework, has this really cool Axe plugin, AXE, and you can attach it really easy to any Playwright run, and it gives you the accessibility score for your thing that you're working on. I really like that. Performance you mentioned, which obviously also Google product, page score. Is it called Lighthouse? Page speed score. That's a really good one. What else have we not talked about that's automatable? Maybe security. That's another one that's easy to scan. Woo has this scanner called QIT, Quality Insights Toolkit, that we're trying to push out to other projects. But basically, it's just a runner that every time you have a plugin pre-release, you would run this QIT. It's open, QIT. But what I like about it is you can plug in any module that you want. It could be security, performance, translations. Is it translated? And basically, it's an agnostic test runner. So check out QIT. I think we may be at time. I think we ended at 10 after. So thank you very much for coming and appreciate the conversation.